Okay, so we've already had a brief introduction to the Vietnam War. We've looked at the background, the aims and the goals of the Western world, so Australia and the US, as well as the communists, so Russia, which was known as the USSR, and its satellite allies. This PowerPoint has been designed in a reflective manner, so we're going to look at North Vietnam and the variety of soldier categories which existed and were encountered by the Western world. So I want you to, the major focus is to consider the Australian soldier experience throughout this period. Throughout this presentation, I want you to constantly think about how Australian soldiers would have felt in these circumstances. So put yourselves into their position and take into consideration the variety of enemy levels and classifications which exist, as well as the novel experiences that they would be exposed to. So, for example, the terrain type that they were working in. So the jungle was new to most of the Australian and the US soldiers, as well as the tactics used, which differed from the tactics that the Western world used during that time. So throughout we're going to come back and reflect on each category of soldier as we go through, and I want you to consider what you think the soldiers of Australia and the US would have felt with regards to their fear, their apprehensiveness, and any other feelings or thoughts and experiences that you think they may have felt or undertaken or been part of. In general, I want you to think about their states of mind at those times. So many of you will have heard of the North Vietnamese soldiers being referred to by the collective term of the Viet Cong, and you'll have developed some ideas of their tactics and their abilities. So, for example, as I previously mentioned, guerrilla tactics and inhabiting the jungle as their battleground. But the North Vietnamese army is in fact much more complicated with regards to the fact that there are multiple categories of soldiers. So there were 4 distinct categories. You had the local guerrillas, the provincial Viet Cong troops, the main force Viet Cong troops, and the North Vietnamese army troops, all of which were diverse with regards to their abilities, their level of confidence as soldiers, where they were located in Vietnam, and what their role what their role as soldiers were for North Vietnam, and how they attributed to the goals and the aims of this particular side during the war. So throughout, as I've said, we're going to look at each of the distinct categories, and we're going to reflect back on how you think Australian soldiers would have felt constantly facing the diverse range of North Vietnamese soldiers. Okay, so first group that we're going to look at is what was known as the local guerrillas. So these individuals were generally located within South Vietnam amongst the Australian and the US troops. They dressed in traditional clothing similar to the innocents within that area, and so Australian soldiers would have had an extremely difficult time distinguishing between whether they were, whether they were just everyday civilians or whether they were enemies. They played a part-time role as a soldier and operated within and around their home areas and villages. So by day they partook in everyday activities and tasks such as farming, but at night they were soldiers for the North Vietnamese, and they provided things like places for the North Vietnamese troops to hide, they provided information, and so on. Generally speaking, these soldiers were more likely to be informants and only engaged in low-level combat due to their basic level of training and lack of weaponry. So as an Australian soldier, how do you think their experience with local guerrillas would be? So the fact that they are extremely close with regard to the camps in which Australian soldiers were located, do you think it would be difficult for them to distinguish between, civilians and the enemy within that area, considering that they blended in so well. So I want you to write down a couple of words about how you think the Australian soldiers would have felt, or what thoughts would go through their head, or what sort of experiences you think that they would have been involved in during such a time. Okay, so this slide we're going to look at both the provincial Viet Cong troops and the main force Viet Cong troops. So there are similarities between them, but there is one main difference, and we'll come to that as this particular slide progresses. So the term that you guys know as the Viet Cong, these are the two soldier groups which have created that generalization surrounding the term Viet Cong. So considering the nature of their role, they had no specific location in which they were based. They were spread out throughout North Vietnam and South Vietnam. They were also spread into Laos and Cambodia, which were the neighboring countries, as we talked about in the previous PowerPoint. So the reason that they were in Laos and Cambodia as well is the fact that they used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which went through both of those countries at different points. So the Ho Chi Minh Trail was used by these soldiers as supply routes and back entrances into South Vietnam. And they benefited from the fact that this trail existed because it was in the jungle terrain, which was in their element. They knew what they were doing when they were working in the jungle. So if you put these particular soldiers in a group with civilians, you would be able to distinguish between them and civilians, considering that they were uniformed. But when you put them into the jungle, yes, they were still uniformed, but their uniforms allowed them to be camouflaged, so they were not easily seen within the jungle. So these particular soldiers were full-time, so they acted as soldiers both during the day and during the night, as opposed to the local guerrillas. So as soldiers, they partook in extensive training and received skills which were essential for their ability to operate in the jungle and engage in tactics such as the guerrilla warfare, which we've heard a lot about. The main difference between these two is that the main force Viet Cong units participated and instigated extremely large-scale attacks which occurred over wide areas and usually involved slightly higher mortality rates. The provincial Viet Cong troops were very similar, but their operations were not as large scale. So instead they operated primarily within their district or within a certain area which they were allocated to. So, based on what we've just discussed and what you've heard about the Viet Cong in passing, how do you think Australian soldiers would feel facing such extremely educated soldiers in regards to their abilities and their tactics and their diversity, and the fact that they were spread so widely throughout the region? So pop down a couple of words or feelings or thoughts which you think would have been experienced. Alright, the final category of North Vietnamese soldiers was the Vietnam People's Army, which was also colloquially known as the North Vietnamese Army Troops. So this particular category of soldiers were based predominantly in North Vietnam, and they had groups within that, such as the ground force, the Navy, the border defense, and the Air Force. So they had a whole variety of different types of soldiers within this one classification. So these soldiers were exceptional. They had training which resulted in the development of highly capable and confident individuals and therefore soldiers. They received annual supplies from Russia, which assisted them in becoming really well equipped, and they were provided with weapons, and they extensive support was received from Russia as a result of their allied sense. So the fact that they were so well trained and they were so well equipped made these soldiers extremely dangerous. Okay, so we're looking at Australian soldiers' experience with the North Vietnamese Army troops, or more formally known as the Vietnam People's Army. So how do you think Australian soldiers would have felt facing such experienced and highly trained, efficient individuals? So again, I want you to pop down a couple of words in regards to how you think they would have felt, what experiences may have been occurring at the time, what you think soldiers' thoughts may have been. Were they scared? Were they terrified? Did they feel confused facing such a range of different soldier types? Okay, so now that we've come to the end of the presentation, what we're going to do is we're going to have a brief class discussion, and we're going to reflect upon the ideas and the thoughts and the feelings and so which each of you have made throughout this presentation from the perspective of an Australian soldier. And what we're going to do is we're going to create a collaborative brainstorm on the whiteboard, and we're going to develop an understanding of the impact the variety of North Vietnamese soldiers had upon the Australian soldiers.